Ahora vamos a cambiar un poquito lo que es el ritmo y vamos a irnos al inglés. Y que vamos a tener una presentación, una bienvenida de parte de Marc Schwartz, el presidente de la Sociedad Internacional de Mente, Cerebro, Educación. Y después de que Marc presenta, va a haber un coffee break pequeño para poder prepararnos por lo que sería la ponencia de hoy noche de Paul Howard Jones. Entonces, ahorita los que necesiten, y ojalá que todos tengan sus audífonos si fuera necesario, él va a hacer su discurso en inglés con la traducción, que está bastante bueno, ¿no? La traducción, ¿sí? Ok, muy bien, entonces. Entonces, por favor, un aplauso por Marc Schwartz.
Buenas tardes, or is it buenas noches? Okay. What I'd like to do, I think, is I had some prepared thoughts, but I was thinking about what Carlos was saying about the two professions. And it was interesting that when I did my doctoral work, although it was in the College of Education, most of my work was actually in the Center for Astrophysics, because that's where the science education department was. And so my advisors were all astrophysicists or physicists. And they would often ask me, why are you doing this in education? There's nothing to measure. Wasn't exactly the laugh that I was expecting, but I assure you now that there is much to measure, and much of what we can measure can lead us to better decisions about the kinds of teaching decisions we make. Certainly the sciences have given us the perspective of trying to think about what is it that we're measuring and to what end. So what is it that we're trying to do to make sure that the goals of our work are well supported by the data that we collect. Now, to another point that was raised by your esteemed president, it's knowledge. Now, there's been 2,000 years more of conversation about what that represents, and I'm not going to unpack that now, but I'd like to make a distinction between often what we think about as knowledge in classroom and the process that generates that knowledge. I'd like to emphasize the process, and I'm thinking about this conference as a process. That means I think about the conference much like maybe someone who is a linguist thinking about this as a punctuation. So I'm thinking about this conference as a comma that's taking us to work down the road. And I want to use my more prepared remarks to talk about the vision I have for the society and for our possible contribution to the work in the society. My welcome slide, in part, was created by looking at the number of countries represented in this room, and this is certainly not all of them. And the wonders of technology, a lot of it brought to us by our esteemed colleagues, the physicists and mathematicians. I went on to Google and found out how I could write welcome in a whole bunch of languages that I don't really know what it means. But I think about the opportunities that we get through the wonderful technology that we have available. So technology also, I think, is something that is a powerful tool, but only powerful in the hands of people who know how to use it effectively. On Saturday, I'd like to give some, in my session, I'll be giving some thoughts about how technology can be used towards those ends. But for today, I'd like to talk more about what it is that IMBES is about. And so I'll read the slide so that the translators have a chance to translate it real time with me. We spent a long time trying to think about, what is it that we're trying to do when we get together in a group. And I take mission statements very seriously, so I spend a lot of time thinking about it and asking myself, when I get up in the morning, what is this telling me to do? So and say, is that really what I'm doing today? Seems awfully hard. So it doesn't turn out to be just the IMBES mission. It turns out to be the IMBES challenge. There are so many moving parts in this conversation, and so many people involved in the conversation, that it isn't easy to navigate. And it isn't anything that we can walk away from with a sound sense of, here's how we proceed. So again, to your president's remarks, that moving forward is not just knowing things, but it's knowing what to do with the things that we learn. When I started my presidency a couple of years back, the first thing I decided to do was to try and figure out, well, what is it that you do? I know what I do as a job. I know what it is that makes me successful, or at least I know what it is that people claim I need to do to be successful. So I started with some colleagues, and this was in 2011. I started with some colleagues just with some surveys, and what we did was just ask people a number of things about their profession. I'm going to share just a little bit of that tonight, not much, but just a little bit to give you a flavor of it. But I wanted to start with the idea that we collectively were going to build an infrastructure. I'll read this again so that you have a sense of what it is, what we're trying to do. We need infrastructures to support conversations flowing from the classroom to the lab and back. Having those conversations and maintaining them, that's really part of the work of this conference and the ones that follow. This conference was designed so Tracy and I and many others, the board that's with us today, spent many hours thinking about how can we have that conversation over time, not over 3 days, but over the time that you spend in this conversation, which we hope is a career and perhaps a lifetime. As I mentioned, back in 2011, we had a conference. It was in San Diego. And the first steps that I took were, as I mentioned, to find out what our members thought. And so 2 comments stood out to me that I thought take the complete range, I think, of ideas that people might feel captures where they are. At one extreme, someone commented, just looking at the survey questions leaves me excited about participating in the discussion. I was also somewhat encouraged by this as well. While I appreciate seeking input, this survey pretends the kinds of conversations I generally find utterly useless. I sympathize with both comments. Somewhere in there, we have to figure out how do we make sense and how do we profit from the things that we do together. First, we need to know something about the community. So back in 2011, it looked a little bit like, as you see up in the top left-hand part, about a quarter of the people that were there, that were members of the society, were teachers. A quarter divided themselves, self-divided themselves as basic researchers or applied researchers, so about 40%, 2/5 of the group. And the rest you can see were divided as administrators, educational psychologists, etc. Here, this year, I took some of the quick demographics that Claudia provided for me, and we see a slightly different distribution. Lots of teachers in the room, and that's great. You're the future. We have, I kind of blocked the researchers in one large group, and then the rest looks a little bit like it did in 2011. So I expect that this relationship will exist over time. As I mentioned, what I did with colleagues is to figure out the many dimensions that separate us. And I'm only just going to share 2, again, to give you a sense of how complicated this conversation is. One is, I think, just obviously, this is about education along with mind and brain. How much time do you spend thinking about education? That was one of our questions. I'm going to guess that the data is not surprising, but it is data. It is something that I think verifies what you might feel intuitively. The basic researchers, followed by applied researchers, sort of the lower end of the spectrum, 30 to 40% of their time. Administrators, much more. And teachers, about 85% of their time thinking about educational issues. There's nothing surprising about that dimension. If I match it against another dimension, I think we see something that becomes a little bit more interesting. How much time do you need before you get feedback that changes what you do? So if you're an applied researcher and you're applying for a grant, how long do you have to wait before you get news of that? If you're a teacher in the classroom, how much time do you need for feedback? I was a classroom teacher. Usually that was measured in seconds. So somewhere between seconds and 6 months or more, I think we begin to see here, at one end of the spectrum, where teachers and administrators need, and of course this is an average, 1 month, There was certainly a wide range, but looking farther downstream, basic researchers and applied researchers, we have a range of feedback here that also separates us. And if we put these two dimensions together, what I see are neighborhoods or communities. And if we're supposed to talk to each other across these communities, we have to figure out how to respect what it is that makes us successful in our own areas. So this was just two dimensions, and there were many more that we measured, and all of them just substantiated that the conversation that we want to manage is challenging. And in so doing, I come to this conference taking what I learned from 2011, diverse communities, dimensions that are useful to us, like how much time do we spend in education, how much time do we need on feedback, what counts as excellence, or a number of others as well, and how do we pay attention to those as we stay in the same room and try to figure out what I think we're all here to do to improve the lives of our children. So in this frame of mind, I also had to balance a number of things that are conventional or traditional. One is the keynote address. I've talked to the people who are our keynote speakers. I'll say a little bit more about them in a second. But what I asked them generally to do is to think strategically, give us a vision that we could use to shape the way that we make decisions in the future. As Claudia mentioned, we have symposia. To some extent, it looks like perhaps the symposia that you've participated in other conferences, but they've been divided into sections that allow conversation to take place. Again, I'll say more about that. This is just a brief comment on the three kinds of experiences that you'll find, and the workshops. I separate that from the keynote in terms of thinking strategically versus thinking tactically. Like, what can we do immediately, closer to, it's Monday morning is just days away. I remember when I was a classroom teacher, Friday was great. Actually, Friday at 4 o'clock was great, because that meant I didn't have to think about school for at least a day. But I knew that Sunday was coming. So all through Saturday, I was thinking about Sunday, and Sunday I knew that Monday was coming, and I had to do something on Monday. So in a way, I'm thinking about these workshops as preparing us for Monday. So this is what you can expect from the keynote. Individuals who draw from experience and research to highlight the challenges of creating usable knowledge. I like to use the word usable with knowledge because there's a lot of knowledge out there that is just static. I mean, it might be nice to know how fast the speed of light is, but unless you can do something with that answers a question that's of importance to you, it's just another thing that we could know about the universe. Point out the limits and promise of translating their work. I think one of the dangers in all the time that we think about knowledge is putting too much importance or thinking that it tells us more than it does. And again, I guess to our president's remarks, it's being very careful about what it is that you think you know. I think that was probably one of the earliest lessons I had as a graduate student. Your friends, or excuse me, your ideas are not your friends. So don't defend them as if they were. And I think with that attitude, it helped me through much of my own career, because ideas come and go. It's important to know the limits and the power of those ideas. Provide a global view of the challenges, promise, and progress in the field of MBE. I feel there's enormous promise in this field. If we move carefully and rigorously, I think we will profit from that. That's what I hope our keynote speakers will be able to give us in that sort of strategic view. As Claudia already kind of gave us a sense of, the symposia begin somewhat traditionally in terms of looking at the cutting edge research in MBE. The key individuals in those symposia will be the researchers and moderators, and their goals will be to present and explore the significance of new research relevant to MBE. So if you're a teacher sitting in that room, I'm going to expect that maybe that's a little uncomfortable. But what I'm asking you to do is maybe relax and ride out the discomfort. And do what my very first philosophy teacher at grad school said to me, Don't try to understand what we're saying. Just pretend that it makes sense and just write it out. And at the end, you'll be amazed at how much you understood. Don't get trapped in the details. Just get the big picture. But know that there's a point after the storm where you can relax. We'll focus on the educational implications. There'll be new people who'll take part in this conversation to help guide it. I've picked facilitators and distinguished educators. Our facilitators are people who understand the field well. Their goal is to help you think about how this can be the ideas can be taken forward. Our distinguished educators will remind us of the realities that we all live in. Some things just won't be possible today or tomorrow. Maybe we have to wait to the future for that. So here's the goal. Explore how the research can be leveraged, challenged, tested in educational context, your context. Use that as the opportunity to think about, how do I move forward with these ideas? The last activity you can expect are our workshops, and there are 3 coordinated experiences, again, as Claudia previewed. Our workshop leaders will provide you a conceptual framework for the work that you will explore. Conceptual frameworks are really important. They give you a sense of what are the ways in which we're thinking about the problems. Not only how do we think about the problems, but what are the tools that we use to think about this problem with. So a second part of the workshop that you can expect is an opportunity to work with these tools. Try them out, see how they fit. I've asked a facilitator to help out the workshop coordinator so that he or she can step back for a second and listen to the conversation that follows in the last step. Discuss how you might participate in this work. I'm not setting any particular guidelines for this, but just think about, in this last part of the workshop, with the facilitator's help, how can this work be moved forward by employing the tools and ideas from the very first 2 points. You'll have roughly 60, 70 minutes to do this in both the symposia and the workshop. There's plenty of time to think about how to move these ideas forward. And I want to see these ideas move forward, and the board does as well, and we've done some things to help encourage this process. So I'd like to say just a few things about that. Here we are in 2013. I've mapped out 3 kinds of activities. You can see on the timeline, I've already mapped out 2014. There's a conference in Dallas that I will host again, and in 2016, our future president, Daniel Ansari, who's in the front, and you've met him, will be hosting that particular conference. We already have a window that's 3 years out, but we're also looking beyond that as well. But initially, in this year, between 2000 and 2013 and 14, I expect that the conversations that come from the symposia and from the workshops can continue to grow. Now, I don't know how that might grow, but I know that if we're in this room, we're interested in taking these ideas and see what we can do with them and how we can use them. So they're informal forums, and I don't know how they will take part or how they'll unfold. IMBES is trying to create a forum for those kinds of conversations. Sometimes they're successful, sometimes they're not. But during that year, I'm expecting that there'll be a small handful of you who will take this work forward to 2014. Maybe in one of 2 ways, as a poster presentation. And there'll be a setup within the traditional poster session so that your work can be reflected and honored as work that started a year earlier. Or less formally, I will structure discussion sessions so that potentially the researchers who are here today may be with us again a year from now and seeing how those conversations unfold. You'll see the same kinds of other activities, keynote, symposium, workshop. We'll repeat what we try out this year. I want to emphasize at this point that this is an experiment. And so like all experiments, I will be collecting data to see whether or not this works. I'll say more about the data in just a moment. Because ultimately, we want to create a conference model that works for you, that's alive, that isn't static. It isn't something that you remember doing in June of 2013. It's something that you use to build towards 2014 and beyond. Like everything in life, even learning to walk and beyond, you need support. The board has generously spent much time trying to think about how can we support 2000 to 2014 going forward. Those of you who decide, I want to take these ideas, I want to run with them. Well, here's one award, the Early Career Award. There'll be more about this on our website. There'll be much more to be said about it, but just in one statement, recognizing early career researchers who have made significant contributions to the field of MBE. The award we've posted for that is $2,500. A translation award, recognizing senior scholars advancing collaboration between research and practice in traditional and non-traditional educational contexts. We're giving $2,500 for that as well. One more award, our final, exemplifying the IMBES Mission Award, recognizing pre-K through 20+ educators. So I think I've covered everybody. Institutions, programs demonstrating success in establishing, building, or supporting infrastructures of change in MBE. This is, think of it as a seed that we're adding to the soil to see how it might take root over a year, and us being able to look back and say, there's some roots here, it takes hold. One other form of support, I can't promise it yet, but I'm negotiating with my own university to also offer a matching award for any student that takes this work here, any teacher, anyone who takes this work forward to 2014 will support with a travel award. Now, to know if all this works, as I mentioned just a few minutes back, we need feedback. And Tracy will be seeking feedback from individual sessions. I am seeking feedback from the whole structure of the conference. You will be getting a link to a monkey survey, or a survey that will have just 10 questions. I tried to keep it short. 7 of the questions will look like this. I'm just going to read off one. They're easy to answer from 1 to 5. The conference inspired me to try a pilot study. It doesn't have to be something that is publishable. That usually is what frightens most people away. This is something that we're using to get ourselves moving. Submit a poster presentation to the 2014 conference, assuming that I have results I want to share. I think of the 7 questions, I think you might know why I picked this one, because this is just one more reminder of encouraging you to think about this conference as the beginning of a conversation. There'll be 3 questions like this. Please identify 1 or 2 suggestions you feel would improve the conference. A total of 10. Your feedback will be taken very seriously. I will be reading it all. I will be using it to shape what 2014 looks like. Gracias. Thank you.